However, as you know, in these formats, I don't share organized shiurim. I share ideas, insights, thoughts that I had over Shabbos, interesting ideas that I've been thinking about. And I want to share a very interesting insight, actually two. We'll start with this one, which is based off of a well-known concept. There's this well-known concept that started in the Yeshiva of Luzhin, Chaim Luzhin, that there was this minhag in Klal Yisrael that at least one person in the Yeshiva of Luzhin would be learning Torah at any point in the day, 24-hour cycle, so that there would be no point in the 24-hour cycle of the day that no one was learning Torah. And the svara was, the idea is that if there was an instant that someone was not learning Torah, that no one in the entire world was learning Torah, the world would cease to exist. So they felt an obligation to fulfill the role of all of Klal Yisrael in the yeshiva, so that at least some person was going to be learning 24 hours a day. They would have a cycle. Now, the way that most people think of it is that if we're not learning Torah, the world would cease to exist. It's our learning Torah that's doing it. So the question is, what does that mean? What is going on here? So I think there is a deeper layer here. And what do I mean by that? There's a famous midrash, Istakel B'Raisa Bar Amma. Kadosh Baruch Hu looked into the Torah and created the world. The world is an emanation, it is an expression of Torah. Now, we're talking about the primordial root Torah, so a much higher level Torah, not necessarily Torah Shebeksav or Torah Shebal Peh, the Torah that we learn, but the root of Torah. The absolute spiritual root of Torah, and that is the spiritual emanative power through which HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, emanated this world into existence. What does it mean that when we learn Torah, we keep the world going? HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, learned Torah into existence. There's this notion that we think that our learning Torah is keeping the world in existence, but there's a deeper layer here as well, which is what happens when we learn Torah. There's this deep spiritual concept that Hashem tzilcha al yad yaminecha, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is our shadow. What is a shadow? Shadow reacts, it's midah connected midah. Meaning, B'teva, the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world is that he responds to how we act in this world. Meaning that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is obviously interacting, emanating down into this world. The spiritual is expressing into the physical, but the physical is then impacting the spiritual. It's kind of like when you have a puppet show, the person on top pulls the strings and the people on bottom will, so to speak, act based on the root, is how it's being pulled. But the way it works in our world is that it's working both ways. That when HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, pulls the strings, things happen in this world. But when we act in this world, we, so to speak, pull the strings and affect the spiritual world. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is our shadow in the sense that HaKadosh Baruch Hu mirrors and reflects what we do in this world. What happens when we learn Torah? When we learn Torah, Hashem learns Torah, so to speak. When we engage in the creative forces of life, when we immerse ourselves in Torah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, engages in Torah. Istakel B'Raisa Bar Amma, HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates the world. If we stop learning Torah, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu would stop Istakel B'Raisa Bar Amma. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu would stop creating the world. But there's a deeper layer here as well, because most people think that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world at one time. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates the world constantly. It's not the Nefesh HaChaim says HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates the world every single instant. So for one instant, we would stop learning Torah. We would stop engaging in the creative force of life. HaKadosh Baruch Hu would stop creating the world. It wasn't a one-time thing. It's a constant thing. We need to constantly keep that engagement from our side, so that HaKadosh Baruch Hu keeps on creating the world. Now, there's a deep layer here as well, because what's the nature of this? Just think about it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is constantly creating the world. How does that work? Just something to think about. Because most people think HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world at one time in history. It was the original creation. But, well, that's true. It's a constant creation. So, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is constantly creating the world, is it HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates the world and then the world goes out of existence and he brings it back into existence? Is it a constant flow of creation? I mean, think about mathematically. Is it points of creation that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, then created another world, then created another world, being every instant is a new creation? Or is it a constant flow of creation? Does the world go out of existence and come back into existence every instant? Just something interesting to think about. But I want to take this the next step. Because I was thinking this will get very into the time we're going to start B'Teves. But the idea of Chomer, this world is created out of Chomer. So the Maharal talks all the time about Tzura and Chomer. Tzura is form, it's like the spiritual conceptual root, and chomer is matter, it's physicality, it's, so to speak, the expressed physical elements in the world. I mean, the physical we live in is full, it's chomer, it's physical. I was trying to think about why the word chomer, why the word for physicality, the word for matter is chomer. And I had a very interesting horror over Shabbos. And we can really spend the whole shir, because these concepts, each of them really require a whole shir, but I'm just going to share some quick ideas on here. The letters that make up the word chomer, ches, mem, resh. What are those letters? So ches is 8. We've talked so many times, Mario talks about this literally like tens of times in all of his svarim, specifically in the beginning of Tiferes Yisrael. The 8 is always the letter of, and the number, the concept of the infinite and the spiritual. 6 represents the physical. It's we live in a 3-dimensional world, which really means right, left, forward, backwards, up, and down. The 3-dimensional world has 6 sides of a cube. But those 6 sides need to be interconnected, otherwise they can just be on the floor. What makes the 3-dimensional world interconnected? That's the 7th. The 8th is Lamala Min HaTeva. So everything spiritual in the world is connected to the number 8. So Torah was given on the first day of the 8th week. That's the paradigmatic 8. That's why Hanukkah lasted 8 days. It's the birth of Torah Shabbat Peh. It's also why the miracle of Hanukkah is with Shemen, the root of Shmona, 8. Sheva is Svi, it's satisfied, but Shemen, fat, is that which expands outwards. It's Lamala Min HaTeva, it's the Neshama. It's everything that is transcendent. It's why the Bris Milah, where we take the most physical organ of the body and we help it transcend its limited dimensions, engage the physical in something transcendent. That's on the 8th day we do Bris Milah. The 8th is always the transcendence. So the root of Chomer is transcendence. Mem, and you can see where this is going, from the transcendent, the ethereal, the infinite, that which has no form. Mem, always the 40th. Mem is Gematria 40. The 40th is always that which has form. So, for example, a fetus, the Gemara says, until 40 days is Mai B'alma. Well, once it's 40 days, then it starts to have form. That's why a mikvah, when you basically go through the recreation process, when you rebirth yourself, that's why when someone converts, they go into a mikvah. When anyone wants to spiritually give rebirth to themselves, they go into a mikvah. It's 40 sa in a mikvah, and the reason it's 40 sa is because you're basically going into formlessness, and then you get back. When you emerge from the water, you get form. It's why the Ma'abel lasted 40 days. The world was recreated. It's why Klal Yisrael went through the Midbar for 40 years. It was the reformation of Klal Yisrael's nation before they entered Eretz Yisrael. Everything that's 40, that's why the Chazal say that Bina, the understanding, wisdom, is given to someone at the age of 40. Deep, when you can give form to ideas, when you don't just know a million different facts, but you can give form, conceptual form to wisdom and knowledge and understanding, then that's the number 40. So you basically go from 8, which is the infinite, to 40, which is form, and then you go to what? Reish, which is 200, which is tunis. Tunis is multiplicity, physicality. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world with the letter Beis. Biracious, that's the start of the physical creation, with the Beis. Tunis, that's why bracha, which is the word of tunis, the Maharal explains, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu goes from the infinite, from oneness, into tunis, is the word bracha, barech, Beis, Reish, Chaf, 220. All letters of tunis. So we go from the infinite 8 to 40 to form, and then express that form into the physical, which is tunis. That's why if you look at Sof Maseh Moshav Tchila, everything is always in the beginning. So what's the beginning? The root of Chomer is Ches, which is the infinite. If you turn Ches on its side, it's the same shape as both Beis and Chaf, which is the other 2 letters of tunis in bracha, which is basically the root of the ultimate letter of tunis, the highest, the most tunis letter, which is Reish, 200, meaning we have 220 and 200 in the Aleph Beis, and the root of tunis is built into the infinite, into the Ches, and it gets expressed into the expressed form of Reish, which is 200. So unbelievable ideas here in terms of the concept of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's creation to the world, the concept of Chomer, the infinite being expressed into finitude, into physicality, within the very notion of the infinite itself. Now, I want to take this one step further, because we are coming from 3 days of klala, of curse, of darkness. What do I mean 3? Because we think of Asar B'Teves as Asar B'Teves, but Chazal actually say that it was really 3 days of darkness. The 8th, 9th, and 10th. Why? Because on the 8th, 9th, and 10th, 3 different tragedies happen. Ezra died. That was the end of prophecy. The Torah was translated into Greek, and Yerushalayim was sieged, was surrounded. Now, all 3 of those days are days where basically the infinite is shattered and a physicality which is not expressed as spiritual. So the concept of translating the Torah into the Greek, which actually happened on the 8th day, is the concept of taking the infinite, Torah truth, and trying to contain it within physical finite letters that can't contain it. Greek language, which in a certain sense, in some sense could have. That's why the Gemara says the only language you're allowed to translate Torah into is Greek, but not the Greek that became the Greek that could have been. Yafes could have resided within the tent of shame. The Greeks could have harmonized with the Jews, but the way that history went is that just like Esav refused his role within the Yaakov-Esav relationship, the Greeks refused their role within the Yafel Kim Yafes Vishkam B'Olei Shem. So we have this notion of the translation of Torah into Greek. The world shook, darkness fell on the world, and we basically fast. There were people who used to fast all 3 days. We only fast on the Sar B'Tevis. People used to fast all 3 days. Then we have Ezra dying. That's the end of prophecy. He was the last prophet. The Chazal say that Ezra was Malachi, and Malachi was the last prophet. That Nevuah ended. That was also darkness and came to the world. We no longer have a connection to the infinite in that sense. We no longer have access to prophecy, which really was very connected to the transition to Hanukkah. And then number 3 is that the Yerushalayim was sieged, surrounded. So Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av is when the walls were broken into and when they actually got into the Beis HaMikdash. But the start of that process happened on Asar B'Teves. And that's when it was sieged. What's the concept of sieging Yerushalayim? Yerushalayim is where the Beis HaMikdash was. It's a connection to the infinite, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu connected to this world in the most potent way, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke to us. Karbanos, the Avodah happened in the Beis HaMikdash. That was our point of connection to the Avin Shasiya, to Kodesh HaKadoshim, to the transition to the infinite. But what happened? They seized, they surrounded. What's surrounding? Surrounding is giving borders and edges. It's constricting, it's giving limitation. You can't surround the infinite. It's impossible to surround the infinite. You can surround the finite. So what they did is they tried to say that, no, we are surrounding the infinite because it's not infinite. It's the restriction of the infinite and shattering it. It's a vessel that can't contain the infinite. And that was the curse that happened on these days. Now, where's the concept of the connection to the infinite is bracha. Bracha, as we just mentioned, the Maharal discussed it, is where HaKadosh Baruch Hu flows from oneness into the two-ness of this world, but it's a two-ness of bracha. It's a two-ness that reflects oneness. But here's where it's powerful. So, and this is where we're going to bring everything together. This is where it gets unbelievable. Who's the source of bracha in the world? Who's the source of klal in the world? The paradigmatic figures of bracha and klal are Avraham and Bilam. Avraham, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says everyone will be blessed, everyone will get bracha through you, and Bilam is the paradigmatic cursor. He tried to curse Klal Yisrael. He represents klala, curse. He knew the exact moment when you can tap into Hashem's klala, the one instant of the day. Now, here's where it gets unbelievable. The Mishnah Avos compares Avram and Bilam. It says one who has these midos is a Talmud of Avram, one who has these midos, these attributes is a Talmud of Bilam. There's this deep comparison between Avram and Bilam. Bracha and klala. Bracha, a two-ness that reflects oneness, and klala is a physicality that's disconnected from spirituality. It's where you give borders and boundaries to the physical, but one that it disallows it from reflecting, emanating, and connecting to anything higher. It's a limitation that's pure limitation. It's physicality that's purely physical. It's chomer that's destructive. And this is where it gets beautiful. What's the other connection between Avram and Bilam? They both rode a chamor. They got up and they saddled their donkey, right? Their donkey. What's the same? What's chamor, a donkey? Chomer, physicality. But Avraham, it says, Avraham rode atop his donkey, a white donkey. Avraham rode the chamor, the chomer. Avraham used the physical to reflect the spiritual. That's why the Torah says that Behibar that with this HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world. The Midrash says, Rashi quotes this, Behibar Ba'avraham. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world with Avraham because the physical world is meant to be what Avraham revealed it to be, which is a reflection of the spiritual. But Bilam, if you remember the story of Bilam, Bilam's donkey controlled him. Chazal say that Bilam actually had an intimate relationship with his donkey, that he was stuck in the physical, and his donkey controlled him, didn't listen to him. And that's really the notion of getting stuck. Klala is where the physical doesn't reflect anything higher, doesn't reflect the spiritual, and when the physical contradicts not only the truth, but you, and you get stuck in the physical, and it absorbs you, it controls you. and that's Chomer, which is a reflection of the Ches, the infinite, is expressed into Tunis with Beis, Reish, and Chaf, Bracha, the expression of the physical into the spirit as a reflection of the spiritual, versus Chomer, that's Klala, that's curse, that's darkness, that doesn't reflect anything higher. And as you can tell, Torah is just awesome. It is unbelievable. It is the chiyus, it is life itself. And I hope these ideas and these thoughts and these inspirational deep nuggets inspire you to think and contemplate about deep Torah ideas. I hope you have an amazing week. And you should, there's a deep idea that when you're so in touch with Torah, that's when chidushim happen. But really, it's when Torah becomes your consciousness, when you eat, sleep, and breathe Torah, that the seeds of Torah sprout into ideas and chidushim. And that's really what our age is about, of Torah Sheba'al Peh, of becoming Torah, thinking about Torah, creating Torah. And my bracha to you is that you should enjoy Torah so much. You should think about Torah, talk about Torah, breathe, live, eat, drink, sleep Torah, and that Torah should just sprout forth from every aspect of your being. And I hope you have an amazing week. Keep learning, keep striving. Have an amazing week.